When mankind came to what is now the region of the Great Lakes, it was perhaps as long as 13,000 years ago. Near the end of what we call the last ice age, glaciers a mile high were receding to the far north. As they moved, those glaciers crushed giant rocks into gravel and sand and carved out enormous holes that filled with melting water from the glaciers. Those glaciers made Lake Huron and the rest of the Great Lakes. But as the glaciers melted, plants and birds and animals moved in. So did humans. Those groups of humans are known collectively by several different names: Indians, Aboriginal peoples, and Native peoples. Traditional Indian stories tell of a creator of all things who placed the native peoples on their homelands. There are many scientific theories on how native people first arrived to North America. Many scientists think the native peoples came to North America by walking from Asia. Today, there is deep water separating Russia and Alaska. On a map, you'll see it's called the Bering Strait. But more than 13,000 years ago, evidence indicates that there may have been a land bridge there, connecting the two continents. According to native peoples and their oral history, they have been here since time immemorial. These first groups of people in North America are often called Paleo-Indians, which means Indians from the old time. We don't know much about them. We don't know what kinds of clothes they wore, what their houses looked like, how their families worked, or their religious or spiritual traditions. Mostly, we have to make scientific guesses about those things. But we are certain of one thing: they had to be very strong people to survive the difficult times after the Ice Age. Most of what we know today about these people is based on evidence from stone tools modified by people and bits of bone. Spear points were among the first tools of the Paleo-Indians and can be found across North America. Some of them have been found near St. Clair County at what scientists call the Holcomb site, named after the person who discovered it. Spear points were an important hunting tool for Paleo-Indians. We also know that in these early days after the Ice Age, giant mammals roamed the land. For example, mastodons, which looked like elephants with heavy fur and huge tusks, lived in what is now St. Clair County. We don't know for sure, but scientists believe it's likely that the Paleo-Indians hunted mastodons because they could provide large amounts of fresh meat, as well as fur for clothing and bones that could be turned into tools. Over time, the climate got warmer, and the glaciers kept melting. If our winters today seem cold, you should have seen what they were like 10,000 years ago. 10,000 years ago is hard to imagine. Let's pretend that every inch on this scale represents 1,000 years. If you and I are living at this end, representing today, and the other end of the scale represents 12,000 years ago, around the time when glaciers had just disappeared, it's still hard to picture how long that is, isn't it? Well, let's imagine that you live to be a very old person of 100 years old. 100 years is 1/10 of an inch on this scale, and a child who's 10 years old would only be 1/10 of that 1/10 of an inch. But what seems like a long time for you and me is only a blink of an eye for the world. The world is always changing, but it changes very, very slowly. As we return to the Michigan of about 10,000 years ago, we see that as the climate was changing, plants and animals were changing too. The mastodons and other giant mammals disappeared. We're not sure why they disappeared. We do know that the native peoples adapted to the changes. They used technology to help them deal with their changing world. Today, we think of technology as computers and televisions and video games. But in the old times, technology meant new tools to make hunting easier.
The invention of this simple device, which today we oftentimes call an atlatl or spear thrower, made hunters of that time much more dangerous to their quarry. It simply acts as a lever, extending the reach and therefore the power of your arm. Just as in the same way you can hit a baseball farther with a little practice with a bat rather than throwing a baseball. It's essentially the same idea.
With the atlatl, they were more successful hunters, and their tribes were better able to survive. Scientists today have theories about what day-to-day life would have been like for native peoples in North America thousands of years ago. Spear points and animal bones are strong evidence of how these people hunted. Traditions handed down through the generations provide indirect evidence that the ancestors of today's native peoples developed many skills to help them survive. Among these traditional skills is that of using natural fibers to make baskets, ropes, and even fishing nets. Techniques developed over large spans of time continue today. Scientists believe it is likely that during the old times, native peoples were relatively few in number and lived in small groups. During this time, St. Clair County and the rest of Michigan was covered mostly by pine forests. Scientists know that not a lot of other plants could grow in such dense, cold pine forests. That meant there wasn't a lot of food in those forests for either people or animals, so they would have to move around a lot, which is easier for small groups and a lot harder for large groups. It also seems likely that if native populations were larger, we would find more evidence of them. But there may be another reason evidence is scarce. We know that the lake levels were much lower in those years than they are today. It is possible that many rich archaeological sites, which would give us even more information about life in those days, are now hidden beneath the waters of Lake Huron and Lake St. Clair. Many net sinkers, stone weights used to hold fishing nets in place in the water, have been found in the St. Clair River. These hand-shaped stones are clear evidence that fish were an important source of food for native peoples in the region. Increasingly, hardwood trees were growing where only pine trees grew before. Many of these hardwood trees grew nuts that people could eat. Animals as well as humans enjoyed the new richness the forests provided. This meant more wild game for the hunters. Migratory waterfowl such as ducks and geese, along with frogs, turtles, and crayfish found in wetlands also added to the diet. Such a rich bounty of food may well have allowed people to have larger families because it was easy to find food. By moving their campsites within different ecosystems in the region, native peoples could provide for all in their family, group, or tribe without having to travel long distances to hunt big game. An even greater change about 2,500 years ago marked the beginning of what we now call the woodland period. Until this time, it is likely that everything that native peoples ate was either hunted or gathered from the wild. But now, at the start of the woodland period, there is evidence that people began to grow some of their own food. This is an important change because it meant people could now settle in a smaller area, with their crops providing them the food they needed. Native peoples still moved often to allow the land and animals to replenish themselves. By moving around, they allowed habitats to regenerate. About this same time, we see that native peoples were now using another form of technology. This technology was in the form of pots made from clay. Pottery is easily decorated in many different ways. Scientists find pottery particularly important to study because often the different decorations and designs on pottery relate to how ancient peoples lived. Many mysteries remain about how these early native peoples lived. One of the most interesting mysteries could be called the mystery of the mounds. Most of the mounds were burial mounds, but some likely were the foundations for buildings. Possibly, temples of some sort were built on top of them. The mystery is, no one knows who these mound builders were, why they built mounds, or why they stopped building them. We know that mounds existed in St. Clair County, including mounds in Draper Park, in what is now the city of Port Huron. Unfortunately, farming and building construction through the years have destroyed these mounds in any hope of learning more from the evidence they contained. It may well be that the mystery of the mounds will never be solved. Somewhat less mysterious is another part of Native history that is located about 50 miles to the north of Port Huron in Sanilac County. This is the home of a series of detailed pictures carved into rock. These are called petroglyphs, and scientists believe they were carved about 1,000 years ago.
The reason that there are so many glyphs and so many symbols on this one particular stone is that for hundreds of years, people have been putting down not only animals that they were hunting or things that were in the particular area, but also we think, many people believe, that there was a spiritual side to it as well.
The Sanilac petroglyphs are important because of the stories they tell about life in those days. But they are even more important to Native peoples today, who consider them to be sacred connections to their ancestors. Throughout their long history, life for Michigan's Native peoples was one of hard work, courage, and spirituality. The traditions of Native peoples living today tell us that their ancestors believed in keeping good spiritual relationship with the world around them.
The Native peoples here had a reverence for all living things. You know, we believed each blade of grass and each tree, each animal had a spirit. And we honored those spirits by even when we hunted, we would, you know, give sema, and we would say a prayer for the spirits of those animals and letting them know that we were coming to take some of you.
For the original people, one of the areas they settled was in Michigan. Today, these people are known as the Anishinaabe, a group of tribes known today by the names of Chippewa, Ottawa, and Potawatomi. The largest group of Native peoples living in Michigan and St. Clair County were known as the Astaran, or People of the Fire. They called themselves by names that referred to their clan or village. Often, they simply called themselves the People or the Original People. Those names again reflect the ancient stories that tell of a creator putting each group of Native peoples in their individual homelands. By the middle of the 1600s, an event happened that would mean life for St. Clair County's Native peoples would never again be the same. Rumors of these strange newcomers from the East became reality for Michigan's Native peoples with the arrival of French missionaries and traders, often called voyagers, in the late 1600s. On August 23, 1679, the French explorer Robert La Salle first visited the Great Lakes. 10 years later, La Salle made a voyage on the small ship the Griffin, which sailed up the St. Clair River, past St. Clair County, and into other parts of the Great Lakes. It is likely that the people aboard the Griffin were the first Europeans to see many parts of Michigan. It was on this voyage that La Salle named the lake St. Clair, because that part of his voyage occurred on the traditional day honoring St. Clair. More Europeans followed. These newcomers were few in number and had customs and habits that seemed strange to the Native peoples. These people brought with them many new things, including cloth, iron tools, woven blankets, and colorful jewelry. Perhaps most significantly, the Europeans also brought with them the most powerful hunting tool ever created: the gun. Europeans also inadvertently introduced many diseases to America. Because Native peoples had never before come in contact with these diseases, they had not built up immunity to them. That means smallpox would have been far deadlier to a group of Native people with no immunity than to European people who would likely have built immunity. The Native peoples did not use money as we know it today. Instead, they exchanged one thing for another. This is called bartering. In those days, the voyagers would trade their blankets, tools, and guns for the pelts of beavers, otters, and other animals highly prized in Europe. Trading was a generally peaceful activity, but things weren't always peaceful. Local histories relate that two major battles occurred in this area. The first was in the 1600s near Sarnia, Canada. The second was in the mid-1700s along the Black River, near what would become Port Huron. In this battle, it is said that the Ojibwa chieftain, Kashkans, led a force of 400 canoes full of warriors against the Iroquois invaders. The Iroquois drove the Anishinaabe off to the west for several decades. The French and British were each jockeying to take control of this part of North America and the massive natural resources available there. Several wars broke out, including the French and Indian War. Each of these wars drew in the French, the British, and the native peoples. The native peoples of this region, which included what is now Port Huron and Sarnia, allied themselves cautiously with the French, who seemed more willing to accept the native ways and less interested than the British in demanding more and more land. In the end, the French military withdrew, leaving the native peoples to deal with their new trading partners. The British were less friendly to the native peoples than the French, which led to a series of confrontations. In 1763, for example, the well-known Chief Pontiac created an alliance to drive out the British. While Chief Pontiac won several battles, the British were too powerful and forced the alliance to make peace with them. Only a decade later, the American Revolution began. This time, some native people sided with the British, fearing that the American colonists' intentions were to move them even farther west. Those fears proved correct. The colonists won and continued to push west. For many years, the region that now includes Michigan, Ohio, Kentucky, and other states was a dangerous, violent frontier. Shedding blood for every inch they were driven back, the native peoples were defeated. They signed a number of peace treaties with the settlers, losing ground every time. Among the treaties signed between the native tribes and the American government was the Treaty of Greenville in 1795, which gave the Detroit area, including most of St. Clair County, to the United States. 12 years later, the Treaty of Detroit gave up more land, including land into the mid-thumb of Michigan. Despite the military efforts of native leaders such as Tecumseh and Black Hawk, native peoples never regained control of the Great Lakes. The official end of large-scale native control of Michigan land came in 1836. In a new treaty, native peoples gave up their lands here in exchange for land west of the Mississippi River, then known as Indian land. Today, most of this land is known as the state of Oklahoma. Moving to Indian land was difficult for the native peoples of Michigan who went there. Despite these events, not all relations between settlers and the local native peoples were unfriendly. Among the native peoples who made peace with the American settlers was a woman known as Granny or Mother Rod. She and her husband, Alexander, were native peoples whose reports of the time indicate were well liked by the people of Port Huron, which then was generally known as the village of Desmond. Granny Rod lived in the area until her death in 1871. She was respected by native peoples and settlers alike for her traditional healing skills, as well as her business of selling baskets and berries. Another local person of native ancestry of this time was John Riley. He was a good businessman and well regarded, although it's uncertain how or why he had a European name. A township in St. Clair County is named Riley Township after John Riley. A native named McCombs ran a tavern in St. Clair County for many years. He often appeared at local business and social gatherings, dressed in a colorful manner that combined the fashions of the settlers and his own native traditions. Another local native man named Tipsikaw was noted for his athletic ability. In the early 1800s, he was the best at sports such as foot racing and wrestling. It was said he could run down a deer on the hunt and was famous for defeating mounted riders in races. Perhaps the most compelling local native personality was Ogama Kigato. He was recognized in the 1830s by Michigan Territorial Governor Lewis Cass for his intelligence and eloquence. The story goes that in 1835, he broke up a fight and was stabbed in the stomach. The cut was so big and so deep that his liver was exposed. According to the story, Kegato reached in and sliced off a piece of his own liver. He then cooked it over a fire and ate it, and said, "If there is a tougher Anishinaabe man around, I wish to meet him." The stories don't report whether anyone took him up on that offer. Today, the impact of the Anishinaabe people can be seen across the state, with the many place names taken from the Anishinaabe language. However, only a few such words exist in St. Clair County. One is Kanoki. It comes from the Anishinaabe word for crooked and refers to twists and turns that Mill Creek takes as it winds its way through Kanoki Township. The town currently named Algonac, here in St. Clair County, sounds like a real Anishinaabe word, but it actually was made up by an American from part of the tribe named Algonquin. And the Anishinaabe word for earth, Aki, Algonac, is not a word that an Anishinaabe speaker would have used. At this time, the landscape in Michigan was changing dramatically. At the start of the 1800s, the land was dominated by huge forests and extensive swamps. But by the end of the century, much of the forests were gone, a victim of the lumberjack's axe and the farmer's plow. These were difficult times for all Native peoples in Michigan. Many now lived on reservations scattered throughout the state. Their children often were required to attend Indian schools run by the government or churches. These schools sought to change the way of life for the Anishinaabe and other Native peoples, to change their way of thinking, and to fit in with white society. The motto of those wanting to supposedly civilize the Anishinaabe was, "Save the man, kill the Indian." Many Anishinaabe from the St. Clair County area ended up on reservations in Mount Pleasant, while others found homes nearby in Canada, at the Sarnia and Walpole Island reserves. Today, the Sarnia Chippewa Band is also known as the Anjouang, while the Walpole Island Reserve still retains its traditional Anishinaabe name, Bekejwanung, meaning where the waters divide. In many respects, life for the Anishinaabe of today is much like any other person's life in the United States or Canada, but they still retain their identity as not only citizens of either country, but as Anishinaabe as well. Native people from St. Clair County continue to share their history and culture with others. Powwows, which are Native cultural festivals, remain a popular way for members of all tribes to meet and share their traditions with each other and the public. The largest powwow in St. Clair County is the Blue Water Indian Celebration, which began in 1994. It has been 13,000 years since the story of Michigan's Native peoples began in the time of the glaciers, when the land that is now Michigan was a far, far different place. The story of these peoples continued through many hundreds of generations as the Great Lakes rose and fell, as the climate changed, as the mysterious mound builders arrived and disappeared, and as settlers from the east took over the land. Throughout it all, Native peoples have survived. In St. Clair County and elsewhere, their traditions tell of a rich history. It is a history and culture that continues today, embedded in the very fabric of the Great Lakes state we call Michigan.
This video is made possible in part by a grant from the Michigan Humanities Council, an affiliate of the National Endowment for the Humanities.